Welcome back to the Pit Stop Ranch. This particular episode, we're going to do something a little bit different and work on one of the cars that's been in our fleet the longest. And one that we take great pride on the fact that we've resurrected it from a cast-off derelict project that we acquired back when the internet was only used for streaming porn. And got it running and driving, though honestly, it still has a few issues. The biggest one is the front alignment. So this project, we are replacing the upper control arm and ball joint and shock for the front end of this thing. And we found a few other issues along the way that will become good future projects as we progress. So sit back and enjoy, and we'll show you how we install this kit.
Alright, so what we have here is a 1965 Ford Mustang that we lovingly call Frankenstang. It's been risen from the dead several times, and it is composed of the pieces of several other dead 1965 Mustangs. So you see that door came off of a 1965 six-cylinder. These fenders are off of a 1965 A code. The chassis is a 1965 C code. The other door in the trunk is a separate 1965 A code. The engine is out of a 1988 Mustang. It is the 5-liter from the factory. It would have been fuel injected with forged internals, but we took the factory fuel injection off and we put a Sniper EFI system on. Pretty soon, like right after they came out, we wanted to test it out, and we've had relatively good results except for when it got wet in the rain. It just didn't want to work, but it dried out and we reset the computer and it's been working just fine since. It's California, so it very rarely rains out here. Let me see what else. When we got the EFI system, we went ahead and got the corresponding distributor so that it has some type of electronic advance on it. And we have the Aeromotive gas tank with the internal fuel pump that's specifically for this EFI system. All of the hoses are AN fittings. Let me see what else we got here. The heads, actually the piece de resistance on the engine is the GT40 heads off of a 1994 SVT Cobra that we've put, we had a 5-angle valve job done on them. We didn't do any porting, polishing, or gasket matching. But we did do the 5-angle valve job, and we put the double springs with the beehive design on there so that we could rev up the RPMs pretty high. And then we did the genius thing of installing a stock cam for the 5.0 because, theoretically those are pretty good. And, the duration and the overlap and all that stuff, that's actually quite stout for a factory cam in this model. They did produce 300 horsepower, 300 foot-pounds of torque, only 225 horsepower from the factory. It is the roller cam, but the design of our engine was for a higher RPM, and that particular cam kind of maxes out at about 4,500, 4,800 RPM. We did take it to a rear-wheel dyno at West Tech, and we dynoed at 225 horsepower, with our limitation being our RPMs. We did max out. If we could swap out the cam for something that the power band is much higher in the RPM range. And since horsepower is torque times RPMs plus the constant, or times the constant, then theoretically we would produce a lot more horsepower off of this naturally aspirated engine. And 225 at the rear wheels with a sloshy AOD transmission is we're imagining we lose about 25-30% off of the AOD. So we would imagine that we've got 300 at the flywheel, just imagining. I don't know. But since then, we've put air conditioning on it, we've put power steering on it, and with, once again, with the AOD transmission, it is more of a cruiser than, you know, a performance vehicle. So 225 at the rear wheels, assuming we change the gearing out, because it still has stock gear. I think the running gear, the rear axle and the front suspension is basically stock. I wouldn't be surprised if we pulled these shocks out and they said FOMOCO on them. I don't think any of this front suspension has ever been changed out. Well, some of it's been changed out. When I first got the car approximately 20 years ago, maybe 5 years into it, I purchased a set of vintage Shelby GT500 brakes. There's the dual piston, and I swapped out the lower control arm, and I put on those brakes. But it's time to swap all that stuff out, because it's all, I went to get it aligned and the alignment guy couldn't even mess with it. And since I have to swap it all out, I took it to him because I figured if he's a pro, then maybe he can get it to work with the sloppy suspension, the factory stock suspension. But since he couldn't, I'm just going to go ahead and swap out the suspension and see where I end up, and maybe try to align it myself. You know, camber, there's really not much caster adjustment on the factory setup. You could get some adjustable stuff in there with the camber and the caster, but really the only real adjustment is going to be toe. Well, we'll figure it out as we go along. Let's go ahead and let's get a little bit started and see where we're at. Oh goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, we recommend following the safety protocols. We have the negative cable to the battery disconnected. We're going to add just a smidgen of lube to our tool. You'll be amazed at how satisfied you can be with what would otherwise be considered an inadequate tool with the proper attention to certain details. Lube being one of those details. You really want to be careful of these springs right there. There's a lot of tension inside those springs. If you're not properly take care of the springs, you can really hurt yourself. I mean, think about it. This is supporting a 3,000-4,000 pound car. To release that tension uncontrolled is a recipe for disaster. So we're going to remove the shock using hand tools. We're going to pull the shock out, and then we're going to put a spring compressor in there, and we're going to use the impact tool to compress the spring so that we can get that out of there. Oh, this deep socket with the extension, that's the perfect distance. Right in between that. That's the control arm bushing. Sway bar bushing, not control arm bushing. Oh, I apologize if you can't see it. We're using a 1/2-inch socket here to remove the shock mounting bracket, shock tower mounting bracket removal. yeah. Look at that. That had gas filling in it, and the gas got all worn out. That is nothing. That is no bueno. So we're gonna put these on, and then we're gonna run up. Gonna run these bolts up right here. This right here. Pull this in. Okay, well, that one didn't work. Alright, so what you see here is I have the front suspension jacked all the way up. And then I ran the spring compressor. So if we get a closer look, it just kind of kicked sideways from where the spring is pulling up from the spring compressor. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to release the jack and see if the spring stays. Oh man, I don't even know how that's gonna work, bro. Alright, so as you can see, this was the bottom end of the spring perch was. This was the top end. We ended up doing was rotating it until this came off of the perch. I don't know, I thought I was recording, but I guess the battery died or something. First step, removing the ball joint, taking out the cotter pin. Oh, wow. The castle nut was relatively loose. So usually people leave the spring on when they do this. And they use the force from the spring to help push stuff around. We're not going to do such things. Mostly because we've already removed the spring. Using a pickle fork is frowned upon in certain circles because it does damage the boot. Damages the boot. In this particular case, that's all garbage anyways. So if the boot gets damaged, saw that, but got separated real nice. Call it the castle nut. So right here underneath this air conditioning system that we just put in, there are a couple of bolts. One of them is right next to the header, so if the engine was hot, this would be a big deal. These are the camber shims. You put these in up against this wall back here, and that's how they align the camber. This is a rudimentary way of doing it, because if that bolt ever comes loose, all this stuff just falls out. All right, well, now that we've got the passenger side control arm off, we have a new replacement spring perch and new replacement upper control arm. The ball joints, the ball joint has been greased. That's what it says. It doesn't look like it's been greased, but anyways, these are factory replacement style. They're pressed in ball joints. If you wanted to replace these, you'd have to cut that off and then put in the screw type. Perch goes in like so. There we go, like that. Screw it in. ACP makes these, the SV50. We got these from Mustang Village in San Bernardino. Scott and Jose over at Mustang Village always help us out when it comes to the Mustang stuff. Fox body, classic Mustang, whatever. They like it all. Yeah, I guess I'll clean up that inside there. I don't think that's ever been touched on the inside. I like to clean up and paint everything. If I'm touching it, then I need to clean it up. And then it just helps keep everything at least not get any worse than it already is. So one of the ways they can adjust caster is by removing these shims. It's going to kick your control arm one way, and by kicking it, like if we remove it from the back, it'll kick it to the rear. It'll change your camber, and it'll also change your caster. We adjust the camber by putting more shims in or taking shims out. For negative camber, you usually want about 1 to 1.5 degrees of negative. A little hard to see because we're in the shadow and everything's painted black and it's all glossy, but so what I wanted to show you is I was talking about caster previously. So this is my upper control arm. This is where it's supposed to hook up right here. So if I were to put less shims in here and more shims in here, I am going to bring this back, which is going to give it a tilt backwards, which is going to cause it to have positive caster. Now if we bring it out even, it moves this angle. Mount your spindle. It moves this spindle forward, which is going to provide negative caster. When you get that's when you get that wobbly on your front wheel. You don't want negative caster. So this is why a lot of people take their car to a professional to set the alignment, because you could put equal amounts of shims in there, and then this looks about equal, and that would give us a very poor effect. It's not going to give us what we want to do. What we want is a slightly negative. Move that back. As we come out and go in, that's how many shims are going to go back there, and that's going to give us our negative camber, positive camber. And then you see, we slide out, slide in, slide out, and we slide in. I'm hoping you see the brake move forward and backwards. So we really only want about 1 degree negative. Want it 1 degree negative. And we could achieve that as well if we had a lower control arm that was adjustable. But the lower control arm on these guys is fixed. Now they make an adjustable lower control arm. Hotchkiss Suspensions makes them. That's the only people for this model. But usually what you'll see is that these are made up of tube steel, and they'll have like a Heim style adjuster, a hemispherical joint adjuster, so that you can push one side out, you can push the other side out, you can push them both out equally, or suck them both in for your racing style. And I don't know why they don't do that for this particular suspension. It seems so easy to be able to do something like that. But the spring compressor that I was using yesterday, that I had previously used for my Jeep, which was this guy right here, it was not working out quite so well. As you can see, it's got a nice little bend in it. It had a bend in it when we started, but it still worked. I probably should have just tossed it away because it was inadequate and didn't even work when I got it. So we went to the O'Reilly Auto Parts and got this guy, which seems to be working a lot better. And took off the passenger side basically without issue using this. This is our gas adjust shock. Alright, so these 3 carriage bolts slide into a socket that holds this shock tower mount in place. We're going to tighten those bad boys down. Hopefully the carriage bolts don't spin. Alright YouTube, there you have it. Our relatively simple one-day project that we had absolutely all the parts for. It took us 3 days and 4 trips to the parts store / hardware store. That's basic project carring. That is however long you think it's going to take twice as much. And if you think it's going to take twice as much as you originally thought, you're going to have to double that as well. So we're actually under the time schedule that our basic formula applies to. So we're ahead of schedule. And the best part is we only got a quarter of what we wanted to do done. We got the upper control arms and the shocks. We could have done the lower control arms. It wouldn't have had any of effect on that. It would have been just as difficult or easy to do the lower control arms as well. We didn't do the lower control arms when we realized how much of a hassle we were having with the upper control arms. But the main cause was the leak in the power steering that we discovered. Normally we would refer to that as scope creep, Wallace apart syndrome, but really the repair to the power steering is going to be a rather major overhaul, and we're going to have to do all the tie rod ends when we remove the power steering. So it seems rather redundant to put brand new ones in and possibly damage the boots when we're going to take the power steering back off. And if we remove the power steering as it sits, we won't be able to drive the vehicle at all. So at least the way it sits, we'll be able to move it around. But we're going to have to overhaul the entire power steering system, power steering pump, the power steering rams and cylinders. That's going to be a little bit of an issue that we're going to have to take care of later. It's going to impede our current progress of replacing the suspension, and that's also going to impede our progress of getting the alignment done. So I do have that I've just recently located I don't know, it's a manual steering replacement bar. It's not the actual bar they use for manual steering, but if you pull the power steering system out, you can replace the power steering system with a solid bar, and you're able to steer and drive and do the suspension and alignment and all that other stuff. So that might be what we do when we pull the power steering, but we don't have time for that now. It's a bigger, it's more than what we had originally planned for. So if I just realized I had that, and if I would have realized that from the start, we probably could have just kept on with that premise of removing all the power steering. It would have been part of our initial teardown, and it wouldn't have added any time to our project, but it was too late for that. We didn't find the power steering leak until halfway into the teardown. Anyways, we're going to put the wheels back on and take her for a drive to see what she feels like with new shocks and coil springs.